Shalom. I want to share an insight into the parsha and the parshiot that we're entering now. Now we're entering Sefer Shmot that we read this morning, beginning of Sefer Shmot. And this week's parsha ends already with the beginning of the Geulah and the foreshadowing of the 10 plagues that begin in next week's parsha. I co-authored a book called Eco-Bible, which is an ecological commentary on the Torah together with Rabbi Leo D. It's in 2 volumes, so this is the first volume on Genesis and Exodus. And in the book we talk about the plagues. Obviously this week and last week the disaster that is on many people's minds was happening in Los Angeles, which I imagine some of you are from or have been there. I grew up in California, and I have a brother who lives in Los Angeles. I have a house in the Pacific Palisades. And I want to relate to that a little bit here. We see with the first plague, the plague of blood, that the water becomes undrinkable, and following that, the plague of the frogs. So the frogs, which are obviously an amphibian, and they go from being in the water to going onto land and to swarming onto the land. Now, the frogs are an early warning species. They're an indicator species. Of all the 15 million species on Earth, why did God choose frogs as to be the first animal that's mentioned in the plagues? So, because one idea has to do with frogs as a bioindicator species, which indicates the health of what's going on in the overall ecosystem. In the case of some natural disasters, frogs seem to know what's coming. So, for example, there are studies that show that in the 5 days before an earthquake or a tsunami, frogs actually react, and they will move. In the case of a tsunami, they will move inland, as do other species. Rebbe Nachman of Breslov teaches that in Hebrew, frog tzfarde relates to the 2 words, tzipor-de, which could be translated as an insightful bird. That a frog has this aspect of dea, of dot, even though we typically don't think of that in relation to frogs, but that there's something that's very intuitive about a frog that's unique to them. Now, as an amphibian, they're able to live both in the water and in land. At the same time, we know that there's this metaphor of putting a frog in a pot of boiling water, and that if you turn the flame on, it will gradually burn the frog without the frog jumping out of that pot of water, as if it doesn't know when there's a slow occurring danger. And that's actually what's been happening over the past several decades, which is that scientists estimate that 40% of the world's amphibian species, including frogs, are on the decline, and many have been extincted. Meaning, of all the species on Earth, the species that's been most responsive to the human impact on Earth has been the frogs. And so in Latin America, many of the frog species have gone extinct. And why is this? Because the frogs are particularly sensitive to pollution because of their skin, which is highly permeable, and the many stages of their life cycle, going from tadpole, and that essentially as a fish, as a tadpole, and then becoming a land species while staying in the water. So they have maximum exposure to toxic pollutions on both land and in water, and they feed on species in both land and water. So at the same time, medical researchers in Australia are finding that frog skin actually has very tremendous healing powers with antiviral and antibiotic characteristics. So the frogs play this role as an indicator species, and so when Moses comes to Paro and says, let my people go, at that moment Paro could have said to Moses, okay, go, yeah, leave. And had Pharaoh done that, he would have saved Egypt from all of the calamities that occurred from the 8 plagues that came after that. Because at the end of the day, the plague of the blood and the plague of the frogs didn't do that much damage to Egyptian society. It was the later plagues that decimated Egyptian society, especially the plague of the firstborn, But the other later plagues destroyed Egyptian agriculture and caused starvation. So there's something here that can teach us as well, because humanity has essentially been disrupting the Earth systems, and we're starting to see things getting out of balance. This fire in Los Angeles is the worst fire in Los Angeles' history. I believe there was a fire in Bel Air in the 1960s that destroyed something like 450 homes, 450 structures. This fire has now destroyed over 10,000 structures. And so it's an order of magnitude beyond. And my brother was telling me that, and I read in the news of how the firefighters, they showed up to fight these fires, these two fires, one in the Palisades, one near Pasadena, and the firefighters were unable to fight these fires. And there's even quotes from firefighters who are saying, that despite all of their training, we're just out of ammunition. We have these fire hoses, but with winds that are almost 100 miles an hour and vegetation that has not had rain since April, essentially, for hundreds of days. Things are so dry, and with human-caused climate change, that the firefighters were simply unable to put out these fires. And now they're getting help from firefighters from Mexico and Canada and South Africa. So it's like the United States, which you would think would have the strongest firefighting capabilities in the world, is not able to put out these fires. And Los Angeles is one of the major cities in the United States. So there's definitely some parallels between then and now. And so I want to also share, in regards to the frogs, that the verse says in Exodus chapter 8, verse 2, Aaron held out his arm over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs, the tzfarde, came up and covered the land of Egypt. And the rabbis asked, why does the Torah reference the frogs as tzfarde and not as tzfardaim? I'll read the verse in Hebrew. Vayet Aharon et yado al meimei Mitzrayim vatal hatzfardeah vatchas et eretz Mitzrayim. So one answer that the rabbis give is that initially one frog came out of the Nile and multiplied quickly when people started hitting it. So they wanted to get rid of the frog, so they hit it, and it's sort of like a whack-a-mole, of where they hit one frog and then another 5 appeared, and they hit those, and suddenly there were hundreds and thousands of frogs. So this is also instructive in terms of how we relate to pests. Some pesticides have been shown to kill natural predators like birds and inadvertently create an outbreak of a different insect pest. So by killing the natural predators, some pesticides actually cause a further outbreak of a different pest that they didn't anticipate. And for example, coyote population numbers often rise in response to humans hunting them, which is the opposite of what's intended, that when a coyote gets hunted, then it actually reproduces more. So it has the opposite effect. One study found that with reduced adult coyote numbers and thus more prey, the number of newborns per coyote mother could double. So we could perhaps learn from the rabbis about how to approach these problems, that sometimes we think that the way to deal with a problem, especially if in relation to the natural world, is to hit it and to try to suppress that problem. But actually, in certain cases, when you go deeper and you look at what's causing this problem, then some biopesticides methods are actually more effective, like using natural pests, natural predators to eat those pests. Another explanation in reference to the tzfarde of this verse is that this one frog whistled, calling its friends to pester the Egyptian taskmasters. All animals communicate. We hear birds, speaking at some level to each other, chirping, and frogs can produce a noise to communicate with each other over other sounds like waterfalls. So frogs that live in the water and that have these sounds from the water, they can actually communicate in a way that goes over the sounds of the water. When David HaMelech, King David, finished the book of Psalms, he was feeling confident, but the Midrash tells us that along came a frog and said, "Don't be full of yourself. For every sound I make, there are 3,000 deep parables that I am saying." This is what the frog said. The rabbis teach that frog sounds mean, "Blessed is the name of God's glorious kingdom forever and ever." Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. That's what the Midrash says is the deeper meaning of the bellow of a frog or a toad. There's a Hasidic story that after the Maggid of Mezrich, the main student of the Baal Shem Tov, passed away, his students gathered to discuss their great teacher and his customs. They wanted to understand why the Rebbe went to the pond early in the morning before prayers. And you probably pray at Nate's at sunrise, and so you probably went at 4 a.m. to the pond. And his students were puzzled by this. Why did the Maggid of Mezrich do this? One of the students recalled the Maggid explaining this practice as a way to learn the song of the frogs because it is so deep and complex. When we extinguish even a single species, we could lose the wisdom of 3,000 deep parables. So I want to finish by saying that, sometimes people think about ecology or the environment as sort of external. That's nature. Nature is Topanga Canyon. Nature is Mandeville Canyon. These are the canyons that border Pacific Palisades, Malibu, Bel Air, which also happen to be three of the richest towns in the United States. And people think that, when we talk about the environment, we talk about something that's external to us. It's sort of out there. Even here in Jerusalem, the environment, like the Jerusalem forest, that's outside here, but we live here in our homes, in our synagogues, etc. But actually, part of what these teachings reveal, I believe, is how we are part of nature and how we interact with nature, and the great sages in our tradition, from King David to others, had a relationship with the natural world. And it's that relationship today that is broken, and that out of that brokenness is emerging all sorts of disasters that are exacerbated by human action. And at some level, we are called on to draw on our religious teachings in order to try to make a tikkun on that, to make a tikkun on how we relate to God's creation. So B'ezrat Hashem, b'zchut the Torah, b'zchut all the deep teachings in our tradition, we should be able to renew our relationship with God's creation and enable the next generation and the current generation to inherit a thriving, spiritually aware, and sustainable planet.